Well, welcome everyone. This is the first time that at Dairy Connect we've decided to interview one of the leaders within the dairy industry. And I'm pleased that for our first person to do so is Barry Irvin, who is the Executive Chairman of Bega Cheese. Welcome, Barry, and thank you for agreeing to do this.
No, my pleasure. Great to be here.
Can I just start by looking back upon your time with Bega Cheese? You became a director back in 1990, having come from the corporate field. What was it that you were feeling at the time to actually get involved with a co-op with 120 members?
Well, look, it's an interesting question, Shaughn, and I guess if I really reflect on it, I had come back to dairy farming because my father had passed away, and I'd actually not expected to be a dairy farmer, and I probably had more ambitions around, if you like, traditional corporate business than being a dairy farmer. But I was sort of blessed with a curious mind. So it wasn't that I had any great sense of what I wanted to achieve back then. It was more that I thought I had something to contribute to the cooperative, just given my background, and I equally was blessed with some pretty good mentors at the time that were encouraging me to they were actually helping me because I was a pretty ordinary farmer. Some might say I still am, but they were helping me be better on the farm. And indeed, I got involved with the Dairy Farmers Association, and they were encouraging me to think about contributing to the board. And I've got to admit I was pretty excited to do so. So when I was asked to think about running, I did, not really being sure what I could contribute. And in truth, that first little period was a real learning period for me.
Indeed, as a fifth generation farmer, now that your son is on the farm, sixth generation, you had a real legacy that you were looking at being able to continue to provide. I suppose that within a short period of time, by 2000, you'd become the chairman. By 2007, you'd become the executive chairman. That's an amazing step forward in terms of what was being done with Bega Cheese and the direction it was intending to take. Could I ask, when you took on the executive chairman's role, did your view in terms of the co-op as it was change and the direction you wanted to take it in?
Not really. So I'd actually always been really interested in, without being trite, value creation. And I'd always been really interested in the connection between the farmer and the co-op and making sure that was a really close, good connection. But also sort of recognised that our business was changing and we could create value in a number of ways for our farmers. And even as I was starting to think about what those options were, and sometimes we used to test them, so do you sell the business, for example? Then, I would always go, no. But there are other options. And when farmers would talk to me, and that generational thing was important. So sometimes when a farmer was deciding not to be a dairy farmer anymore, I would sit there wondering whether the cooperative model were actually rewarding them for their sometimes generational contribution, because they would be paid out the dollar that they put in, and on we would go. Now, that's fine in some senses, but because we were creating an enormous amount of value at Bega, I wondered whether that was the right model. So I literally, not long after 2007, started talking to farmers about the options that they might have, because at the end of the day, they were the owners. And I used to always say to them, my job is to actually put options. I won't be offended if you say no, but you should know what the value opportunities are here. And I guess I actually believed that you could realise value, but keep culture. And that's always been really important to me. So I've actually seen culture as more important than structure. So whether, there's some cooperatives that got their culture wrong. And I would like to think that there is companies like ours that's ASX listed that maintain that culture and value base that quite often came out of cooperatives.
Which is very important in terms of the way the business was going to grow and go in the direction. When you say culture, what did you feel that you were looking at the time, and how did you think that it would improve by moving it in Bega Cheese into a new direction?
Well, I guess there was two pieces. So, we had always been outward looking, and we became more and more outward looking in terms of, quite frankly, how we would sustain this business in the long term, how we would actually make it continue to create value. Because you can be terribly philosophical, but if we built, my perspective, if we had built a wall around the Bega Valley and said that's where the Bega Cooperative belongs and that's where it'll stay, we would have gone the path of many other regional cooperatives. So because we were outward looking, that meant that we were creating value from a number of different areas and a number of different geographies, and then ultimately a number of different products. And so then it was a question of, well, how do we keep growing? How do we keep and I got to the point where I thought we needed to structurally change to continue to grow. So I did have this philosophy, which I continue to hold today, that you do need to continue to search for growth. Now, obviously profitable growth, but you do need to search for it, and you do need to think about what your customers likely to look like in 5 or 10 years' time and what they're going to expect from you. And so because I always had that philosophy, it tended to always lead me down a path of, well, what structure do I need to meet that? And then, going back to that earlier comment, and how can I do that and still preserve the values and the history of the organisation, which is equally important. And I actually think, ironically enough, important to the success of the organisation in preserving those values and acknowledging the history of the organisation.
Bringing the culture into the new structure is vitally important. Clearly, it's become the success story that Bega Cheese is now. I just want to touch on just briefly Murray Goulburn and the fact that it was a co-op as well, but it appeared to go on a slightly different path in terms of the development of a unit trust structure with keeping the membership base of the co-op.
Yeah.
Was that something that you thought about as well?
Yeah, so interestingly, Shaughn, I could debate the merits of being a cooperative as well as I could debate the merits of being an ASX listed company, for example, and any number of the structures in between. So when you talk about that first period of time, in that even 1990 to 2000, I spent an enormous amount of time trying to learn about the structural options, and even then up to 2007, up to we listed, I globally looked at any number of structures. We had a very consistent corporate advisor that would sort of slap me around if I, on structures that hadn't worked and historically hadn't worked. So I did very much come to the conclusion that and if people recall, we did put shareholder caps in the early days of going to an ASX listed model. We did put in our constitution the requirement for farmers, dairy farmer suppliers, to be on the board of the ASX listed company. So all those things were part of preserving some of the things that I saw value out of a cooperative. But I equally concluded that you couldn't be, for the want of a better way of putting it, half pregnant. You needed to make that decision. You needed to put the building blocks in that would protect culture, but the idea that you could do both and preserve and sort of say you're a cooperative, but have this other sort of master, if you like, to one side that didn't have a vote, it actually created, the way I saw it and the way I'd seen it around the world, it created more turmoil than peace because you actually, the irony about having, whether they're a farmer shareholder or a publicly listed shareholder, the idea of democracy is a good thing, and so if you have somebody that's giving you a large amount of money but then say to them you've got no say, that actually doesn't solve your problem. You're actually better to have them feel that they do have input and a say, but in the end, like all ASX listed companies, you need to win the confidence of all shareholders, whether they be farmers or whether they be other shareholders. But having it clear that everybody is treated the same as far as your shareholding base is concerned, I think is actually easier to manage than having this sort of thing where I say, look, I want your money, but I don't want you to have a say in an election for a board, for example. Now, as I said, we've carefully thought about that in terms of saying we want an obligation in our constitution to have farmer directors on our board. So our institutional shareholders know that, support that, and never sort of object to the fact that they've got to decide sometimes, which farmer they're voting for. But it's worked, but it wasn't a conclusion I came to lightly, Shaughn. It was literally, when you say did we consider it, I think I just considered every structure that I'd ever seen around the globe, trying to work out what the right answer was. And to be frank, part of that was about being able to go to our then original cooperative shareholders and say, ask me any question you want about any number of these options, and hopefully I have the answer for you, or I've considered it, and you can see why we're landing in this way or that. So I, as I said, I always thought that this was a decision for shareholders. It wasn't a decision by me. It was my job to give the information and I always said to my, cooperative shareholders at the time, don't be concerned, vote the way you think is correct, because I will not be upset. Whichever decision you make, I will continue to lead this business.
Well, clearly you brought them along, because my understanding is that of those 120 dairy farms, they remain shareholders now, and I think that's a true testament to the structure that you were able to implement and the faith that people had in the direction that you were intending to take. But you came in and established what would be, in some ways, considered a dairy minnow. You were there, cheese was partly what you were famous for. At what time did you think, because you spoke about the importance of growth, when did you think about going into a diversified approach, moving away, such as in recent years that you have, to be able to continue to grow the business in a manner that allows the share price to continue, but also provide the produce that is so vitally important to the customer at the supermarket?
So I think our first sort of expansion was obviously a geographic one, where I kept saying, if we need to grow, in dairy, we need to be in Victoria. And interestingly, circumstances can be important. So obviously the millennial drought, Tatura found themselves in difficult circumstances. It was an opportunity for us to grow geographically. Interestingly, people were saying, oh, Northern Victoria is a difficult area for milk, particularly during that drought period. Why would you want to go there? But the truth was, it was an opportunity to go there, and to a certain extent, we were used to managing a dairy business on limited volumes of milk.
Yes.
So we were more confident that we could actually go there and say, we think that this will be, to us, it was still a substantial expansion, a substantial volume of milk, but it allowed us to begin that path of climbing up the mountain, if you like. And interestingly, when we made the decision around Vegemite and peanut butter and buying Mondelez, it surprised everybody as we turned, a pretty strong right to go into dairy and food, when we were very much a traditional dairy company. The interesting thing there was that I would say that all the steps of the way, and we'll no doubt talk about it later, had to be put in place for us to be able to have a chance at bidding for something like wine. So what did we recognise that we didn't really have in our skill sets and portfolio? It was really branded knowledge, scale, stronger links with the retailers. And if you sort of thought about wanting that in your business, and there's tales of many businesses trying to get down that path, and indeed trying to create those brands or do whatever, and they struggle. And we went, well, if you're an Australian company that was trying to grow and you wanted a brand that you could rely on, and that you knew that the retailers wanted on their shelf, and that indeed your customer always wanted to buy, there's not much better than Vegemite. And so when we came to realise there was an opportunity to buy it, and obviously it was through relationships that we realised that, and it wasn't expected, and it was very confidentially done, we knew that we were adding not only, a diverse product range, but a big skill base around branding and marketing that we didn't see that we had in the business. So we were sort of, there were many ways up the mountain. We were turning left so we could go right, if you like. So we needed to make sure that we could build size and scale. So, talk about growth. I think without that transaction, and without the scale that added to us, without the profitability that added to us, we wouldn't have been in the position where we could then take the next step, which was indeed Lime, which took us back into dairy more strongly. But I would say, sitting here, that diversity has proved extraordinarily valuable during COVID. And some people will always debate whether you sort of stay down one singular path or you diversify. In my experience, whether it was within dairy, where we diversified into things like infant formula, which proved to be very strong for us, and obviously cream cheese from our traditional business model, if you like, that diversity has served us well. And this is just another step in diversity that, in pretty uncertain times in dairy, having that sort of solid base has really helped us.
And clearly that decision obviously gave great comfort to the banks, because they realised the business model that you had in play was one that they could feel comfortable in loaning to you the necessary funds eventually to go into the Lion acquisition. Was that just a case of being at the right place at the right time? or was that a genuine desire to no longer be where you were, but for Bega Cheese to move to become a major processor within Australia, challenging Saputo, Lactalis, and others like that?
So look, I'd put it another way. I think the first thing I always worry about is the strength of our own business, and where I think the market's going, and the tools that will give me strength, if you like. And I had for a very long time been concerned that we weren't in fresh dairy. We weren't in products like yogurt, flavoured milks, and so we were good in long life dairy, but in terms of farm gate milk price and things like that, we found it very difficult to compete against the fresh dairy players. And so I always saw that, we really needed to be there, but we needed to be there a little bit, what I was saying earlier about the acquisition of Vegemite. We needed to be there at scale. There was no good sort of trying to do it in a popcorn way, if you like. And so it was always something that I guess I dreamt of in terms of making the business more whole. It was always something that was, quite often out of my reach. And I think the sad thing is that many people would remember exactly how much it took to put the Lion Dairy and Drinks business together, the amalgamation of dairy farmers and National Foods and the orange juice businesses and everything that was in that business. It was a very large capital outlay that a company like Bega could have never expected to sort of bid for. But I guess somewhat disappointingly, but good for us, a lot of that value was eroded over time as the industry changed and became more challenging. So it eventually came to the point where it was actually in our financial capability to buy, but it was a long-held ambition to strengthen our business. And to go to the second part of your question, of course, we want to be able to compete against the global players. We do want to have an ambition, if you like, of being the Australian company that can compete and can stand up, because to a certain extent, it's always bothered me a little that Australia is very good at producing food, and we produce great food, but for some reason we leave the manufacturing and the marketing and the branding and the premiums associated with all those to international players, and we for some reason have not had the confidence to do it ourselves. And one of the things that's sort of pleasing for me is not only the fact that we've been able to put it together, but we're now seeing big institutional shareholders support an Australian company like Bega. We had to do a capital raise. It was very well subscribed to by institutional investors, and I think that reflects a bit of a change. But in the end, I also always say, you can't actually blame institutional investors if you don't present an opportunity to them and present confidence and performance to them, and that's what we've been able to do over an extended period of time.
At the moment, you're flowing on from that. Is that part of where you see Bega Cheese going to, not just remaining an Australian icon, but moving into the international space? Or is that still too early?
It's still, look, I think, so I kind of go, there are two parts to this. We've obviously got to get the Lion acquisition right. It's a big acquisition. We've basically doubled the size of the company. We know that there are great opportunities. We also know there are challenges there. So I'll keep the team very, very focused on getting that amalgamation of the two businesses and addressing the challenges that we see within Lion. And that's going to take us a little time. And if we actually look at even, the acquisition of Vegemite and Mondelez happened in 2017. It's taken us a couple of years to get that embedded and rolling properly and fully integrated. And I'll expect the same with Lion. Now, beyond that, I think our first thinking will probably remain within Australia, or even potentially could be Australia and New Zealand, but we sort of sit there saying there'll be still further opportunities within Australia. They'll be more limited, of course, because of our size and scale. I think internationally, again, I'd probably reflect on how we grew Bega locally and think about how we might do that internationally at a low risk rate. So I don't think you'll see us charging out and committing, tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars to an international acquisition, unless there was a really good business model behind it. So I mean, I think one of the things that is unique about Bega is that if you track our growth, we had no problem working with our dairy partners. So our competitors were also our customers, and we were very happy being a service provider, and we were very happy, making a little bit of money at a lower risk while we grew the capability within the company. That would be probably how we might look internationally, but we've got to get Australia right first.
Touching back on Australia, the line acquisition has made you a major producer of fresh milk. You're now bringing on a large number of dairy farms throughout Australia to be able to ensure the value chain. It has a win-win situation, which is so vitally important at the end of the day. The customer wants to get the best price for the fresh milk and nutritious fresh milk and the dairy produce, but the processor needs to also make a profit, as does the dairy farmer. How do you see that engagement continuing into the future, given that you're bringing in a culture that has clearly worked? How do you now transcend beyond where you are to where you will be?
So look, you're right. I think we've got to stick with the model and the values that we have. So it means that we get as close as possible as we can with our farmers, and to a certain extent, while we talk about price, transparency on price is really important. And even transparency on the performance of the business is important, because I think I'm very inclined to say to the farmers, to the extent that I'm able, obviously being a publicly listed company, but here's our financial performance. Let me explain why. Let me explain what's good about it. Let me explain what's terrible about it. And I'd like you to understand it the same way as the farmers want me to understand what their financial circumstances are. Because I think if we do, there's then sort of a collective confidence about the fact that we're in this together. And that collective confidence builds a better understanding about the challenges that may be faced on farms because of pricing volatility or because of competition or whatever it might be. So it gives a clearer signal to not just about a contract for the next year or 2 years or 3 years, but what are the dynamics that are driving this supply chain. And I've found generally we obviously need to be competitive, and we obviously need to make sure that we have sustainable milk supplies in each of the regions that we operate in. But we also need to be honest, and we also need to be honest about where the problems are. And my history is that when you do that with farmers, they become part of your solution. So I would like to move as closer to the farmers than I think Lion traditionally has been, and I would like to sort of build a collective wisdom, if you like, about how you go forward. And that requires leadership from me. That requires me to not only tell the good stories, but tell the bad ones as well. And I think if you do that, you create a longer term bond, which is what we've experienced with our farmers, and you create this mutual understanding of the drivers on farm as well as the drivers in the business, and that'd be. I want to preserve that process going forward.
Thinking of good stories and just moving away from the line acquisition, you've never forgotten the roots of the company, where you're from as a working dairy farmer yourself, your son now taken on that role as well, and no doubt a next generation that's in the works coming forward. You're in a trial at the current time with Rabobank and KPMG, a pilot program, if you will, called Circular Economy. It's about making everyone a winner. Can you just give us a little bit of a touch on that, and how you see that being part of your social license within the area?
Well, I mean, I think, so I love the concepts of circularity, and really, if we think about how we've got to this point, we live in a take, make, dispose culture that is not going to take us forward, and we can, talk about the various dynamics around, whether it's climate change or whether it's other dynamics within the industry. But the truth is, the more we can bring circularity, so the more we can keep something in production, creating value, the better off we'll all be. And so as we've sort of been trying to adopt that, we've been thinking deeply about how that applies. It's if you like, the next level up from our environmental sustainability program that we put in place 10 or 15 years ago. And this is all about thinking about everything that is in your supply chain and how it can create value. And it's not just about the dairy supply chain, it's about the entire community. So, the old one man's trash is another man's treasure is exactly what we're trying to think about with the entire community. So we think about it from the catchment to the estuaries, and we think about it from the chicken farmers to the hops growers, to the dairy farmers and the beef farmers and the oyster leases, and the council and their organic produce and whatever else it might be, and the impact of concrete and the costs associated with it, how you can use renewable energy to actually cut your costs. So all of those things, we suddenly start to try and bring the community together. We also think about our supply chains, how we create more provenance, more value for the consumer in terms of, an affection and an understanding of that full supply chain. We think about tourism and agri-tourism. So we think about, the income streams that farmers receive today could well be changed by circularity. So you talk about, so in us, as dairy farmers, we talk about, we sell milk and we sell dairy beef maybe, and we sell chopper cows and those sorts of things. But we don't think about the carbon credits that we may be able to generate on farm and whether that's a potential income source for us. In some people's cases, it could be agritourism. And so we, in the Bega Valley, we're talking about networked water storages that are substantial, that we would call a dam for irrigation, somebody from Sydney might call a lake. And so we are at the moment linking the entire community together with the support of Rabobank and KPMG, and indeed a local steering committee, to see where we can create value across the entire supply chain. And to your point, what a wonderful outcome if we get great environmental outcomes and great economic outcomes. And that's the goal of circularity. And we'll, as we did with our original Bega environmental management system, we'll pilot in the Bega Valley. Great place to pilot it because you can measure everything. There's 4 roads in, there's 2 rivers. You can measure the entire valley really effectively. We'll do it with the entire community. We'll find the models. We'll find the things that work. We'll also no doubt discover the things that don't work. And then we'll be able to expand that out to other regions, and that's our ambition. But you need to start somewhere, and quite frankly, you need to be ahead of the curve. It's probably worth just dwelling for a moment, Shaughn, that the way this started was that in the Netherlands, they don't talk about emissions targets anymore. They talk about having a fully circular economy by 2050. And so that was the information that Rabo and KPMG brought first to the company Bega, and what happened was they said, you might want to think about circularity projects within the company. But of course, it didn't take very long to realise for it to really work, for it to really make a difference. Bega Cheese doing things would be nice for the company, but it wouldn't make the difference that if you can get the entire community involved. And we've had success with that in the past, so that's what we're doing now.
It's wonderful to see you bring in them all along, and truly this is a public-private partnership that has great prospects for just not your area, but elsewhere throughout, not just New South Wales, but Australia-wide. So we'll be watching this space and seeing where it might end up. Recently, the Senate committee has handed down its report into the performance of the Australian dairy industry since deregulation. It's given 14 recommendations, all of which really have been said before, to be honest about where it's at. There's been 10 previous reports since 2010, so we've really had a report from the federal government, one a year.
Yeah.
It's beyond now just having reports with recommendations. But what I'd like to ask you is not so much about the report, but if there was one recommendation that you could think of that required government support that would receive bipartisan support, what would it be?
So Shaughn, I'm a bit old-fashioned, and the answer might surprise you, but I'll go back to my leaving banking and returning to the farm and not being a good farmer, and the reality is that when I went back to farming, the government had a dairy officer, a beef officer, an agronomist, any number of support staff, whose job it was to come out and tell you what the latest research was, tell you what they thought might be valuable for your property, and they would sort of drive you a bit mad because they just knock on your door. Now, they weren't selling anything. They were there to get productivity for you on the farm. You were never suspicious that, is this guy just selling me the latest thing? They were, long-term, based in the industry, had a good spectrum of knowledge, understood the issues going forward, and they were in every district. And they helped every farmer develop their business, perform better. When government withdrew from that, I know, the argument is, well, it was replaced by commercial actors and the bigger farmers didn't need that extension support. But for me, even to this day, I would go, we all need it. The real challenge we have is still when somebody's coming to talk to you about the latest technology or the newest thing, they're then normally saying you might like to buy this or you might like to buy that. And it kind of just causes that hesitation around productivity. But, we had so many trials that would be going on in the Bega Valley around different things because we had the local guys there wanting to actually prove up the research that was being done. I don't think we lack research. We lack extension and we lack all the opportunities that brings. And it's so I know that's not a market thing, but I go in terms of if I think about where the Australian dairy industry started to struggle, it was when there was a variety of models of dairy farming and nobody was quite sure what the right model was, and of course there's a variety of regions, so it's a little different to New Zealand. But when I look at New Zealand, that extension piece, that sort of these models work, this is what you should be thinking about. I think it's been lost, and it was an enormous amount of IP, and it wasn't IP where you had a turnover of staff that was gone every year or two. These people were generally long-term in the community. They were long-term thinking about the next step and the next step. And if I was saying to government, if you want to do something that's really practical, think about restoring that extension capability. The market's a bit tougher, and I know there's discussions about regulation and things like that, but we know we live in a trading economy, and we know we live in an environment where that's not something that government's likely to revisit. But they can do that.
That's a challenge to organisations such as Dairy Connect and every other state dairy organisation, as well as farming organisation, to actually follow through with what is, I think, an important component part of agriculture generally, just not dairy. But the loss of those extension services, as you quite rightly point out, has lost that corporate memory in some extent, that resource that you could always rely upon. So I think what you've said is a wonderful thing for advocacy bodies to consider, and please be assured that we'll certainly do so.
Thanks, Shaughn.
As we come to conclude what I found extremely fascinating, Barry, as you look back over decades within the dairy industry and you're looking at succession planning for yourself, not only on the farm but also within the company, as you reflect, what would you think is the legacy that you will be most proud of as you look back over time?
Look, it's a really difficult one, Shaughn. It's hard to think about your own legacy. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I'm sort of a humble person and kind of go, you know what, I had a whole lot of people help me. I had a whole lot of, in my early days, I had a whole lot of great mentors. In the later days, I had a whole lot of people that were willing to challenge me to get me to be better. And if I think about legacy, I think what I'd probably say is, maybe I'd answer it in a different way. So I will be forever grateful to the dairy industry for the opportunities that it has given me, and those opportunities extend beyond dairy. So the fact that I can talk about circularity and know that I can get support, whether it's from government or other businesses or the community or whatever, the dairy industry's allowed that to happen. Many people may know, I chair what's quite a large charity now because I have a son that's profoundly autistic in Giant Steps. Indeed. And in the early days when we were trying to get Giant Steps out of the ground, there were so many people in the dairy industry that helped me, and there were so many people that offered support. So So I guess I would probably like to think that, you know, what legacy. I think I would love to be the example, you know, with all humility, that other young leaders in the dairy industry would say, you know what, you can achieve a lot if you have a vision and you actually have a passion, and you keep pursuing it, and look at that sort of farmer from Bega, Irvin, that was able to achieve all those things, not only within dairy but within the community. Maybe I'll aspire to do that, because I think that's the most important thing. It's leaving, ironically enough, in that sort of cooperative model, it's leaving the value in the next generation's hand to go forward. So if that value is just an example to follow, if that value is just the way in which you carry yourself, the encouragement to think wider, to sort of believe in your dreams, I think that would be the legacy I'd probably like to leave.
Barry, look, it's been wonderful talking to you. Clearly the passion you're demonstrated is in Bega cheese, in its fibre. It flows through to all component parts of what will become, I believe, an international company that will rival other dairy industries in other countries. I look forward in the years that come to watch and see where else a great Australian company, Australian owned, will eventually end up. So thank you so very much. It's been a great pleasure, and I hope that you've all enjoyed this opportunity to have this chat with Barry. And if you thought that this had some merit and you found it of interest, please let us know at Dairy Connect, because if you did, I'm very happy to go meet with other people and chat with them, and also talk about why it is the Australian dairy industry needs to continue to be sustainable, viable, and have a growth and future as we move forward.
Thanks, Shaughn.